Hi everyone! Thank you again for tuning in to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia. I'm so excited to bring you today's interview because I had the amazing privilege of talking to Veronica Hinke, who is the author of the really fun book Last Night on the Titanic, Unsinkable Dining, Drinking, and Style, which is all about the food and the drink and the clothes and all those really fun, pretty little details of the time. So I really hope you enjoy my interview with her as much as I enjoyed doing it. I'm really excited to have you. I've always wanted to have my own talk show, so I'm just giving it to myself. So I would really like if you introduced yourself and told me maybe a little bit about your journey specifically to Titanic before I get into your book and everything.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for talking with me today and reaching out. It was so great to hear from you. And I love talking about the Titanic because I think so many of the stories are so inspiring for people today.
Yeah.
I love talking about food trends and, food styles of different eras. And that's what led me down this path of the book. I'd always researched Titanic, but specifically about food after I had been a food writer for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And when remember in 2012 when it was the 100th anniversary of the Titanic?
Yes.
As we approached that, Alexia, I just had to tell a food story about the Titanic. I thought, that's what I do. I feel like I need to do my part and tell a story. And the thing that I could do best is tell a story about food or drinking wines, cocktails, champagnes. And I was trying to remember the other day how I stumbled across a list of items that were found at the resting site. And many of the bottles were still intact. I was so excited to find out about all the details about each of the bottles and or many of them. And I pitched the story to Wine Enthusiast, and it ended up being a 250-word article. And it's a really neat story. It was in the dead of winter in 2017. I think it was January that winter. I could be off, but somewhere around there. And it was a quiet Saturday night. And I got a text from a publisher with a book company, with Regnery Publishing. And he said, are you the person that wrote this article for the magazine? And I said, well, yes, I am. He said, well, would you write a book about it? Yeah. And I thought, I tell
What
that
a dream.
Story. Yeah. And I share it because so many people are pitching stories. You pitch away, and you sometimes don't always land everything you pitch.
Yeah.
and it just takes that one thing that is a good idea that people really connect with.
Yeah.
So my next challenge was, how am I going to get a book out of 250 words?
Yeah, a book is a lot of content. Like, what at the end of it, do you know the word count of your book at the publishing, or around how many words it actually was?
I don't. I'm trying to think of the words. I know that there were 300 some pages. Ballpark.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book. I was just trying to give a comparison for like 250 words to X many, because it's a very arduous ask. It's a big undertaking.
Yeah, it really is. And you have to really want to work hard if you want to do a book. Right. So I was very blessed that this article was found. And I thought, how am I going to turn this into a book? And I want to do it justice. And I wanted the project, and I want to do these people who were aboard the Titanic. I want to do them justice more than anything and be really respectful. So I thought, well, gosh, I love finding out about people. I've been a reporter, since I was a kid. And I want to interview survivor relatives. I want to find out about the people who were on board, who had something to do with food. And I grew up learning about a guy who was on board. He lived in my hometown. I lived there only for a little while, and then we moved about 30 minutes away to Wausau, but he lived in Merrill, and he was an immigrant.
What state is this? I don't know.
Oh, that's right. I didn't tell you what state. It's in Wisconsin.
Okay, I'm horrible with geography, even my own state.
Me too. I know what you mean. So yeah, Wisconsin.
Okay.
and northern Wisconsin. So it was always interesting to me how he got onto the Titanic.
Yeah, that's a bit of a journey.
Yeah, in those days when everything was horse and buggy up in
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin where he lived. And he was a popcorn vendor. So
Oh,
yeah, I was really tickled. I thought, I finally get to tell the story of Popcorn Dan, is what he went by. He was a third class passenger. He did not survive. I
oh.
don't know his story. I do know about a lot about his life
Mm-hmm.
and where he was going and where he was coming from. And I had so much fun with this book, finding out about people like
Mm-hmm.
him. I found a letter in the
Oh,
Brooklyn Daily Eagle. And is it the Brooklyn Daily Eagle or the Brooklyn Eagle? I think it's the Brooklyn Daily Eagle.
you
Pretty
said
sure.
it confidently, so I'm gonna go with whatever you say is correct.
Yeah, I think it's Daily Eagle. I'm just drawing a blank there from a little bit of a hiccup there. But he wrote a letter to his friend who at that point was the dramatics editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle.
Oh,
And he said, I'm going to be arriving in New York City. He gave the date. It'd be great if you could meet me now it's Chelsea Piers is where they
mm-hmm.
would have docked. I was so excited to find this letter online.
Yeah,
At that point, I found it through the microfiche in the library. And
right.
the man was H.V. Coltonborn, also from my hometown.
Okay.
And he went running into his editor's office the next morning and said, I have a letter from somebody from the Titanic.
Wow.
Can you
What a
imagine?
thing to have.
Yeah, yeah. And so sad that he was never
Yeah.
able to go and meet Dan, but he was gonna hang out with him and they were good friends from school, I think is where they
Mm-hmm.
met. Well, it wouldn't have been school probably because they were both adults when Dan moved to Merrill, he was an adult.
Gotcha.
But it was really neat to find those things and
Yeah.
just little whispers from the past and to learn about these people. And
Mm-hmm.
we actually found that there's some money at the I say we because there's a lot of people that are huge
Sure.
fans of Dan's. There was some money at the resting site that was found that said Merrill on it. And
Mm-hmm.
back in those days, they printed their own money in the banks.
Oh, cool.
Yes, yes. And so we, many of us think that that's probably Dan's money, the dollar bills that were down there, and that there were some coins and dollar bills. And
Wow.
so yeah, so it's just been a wonderful adventure to get to know these people a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. And it's I always wondered, how we would have connected if we would have been friends, or
Right.
because I'm sure I would have visited with Popcorn Dan on the sidewalk where he sold his popcorn. And so
I feel like
that's the story of how that all came together, how it turned out the way it did.
that's really incredible because, firstly, I feel as though anyone who makes it his life mission to sell popcorn would be an excellent friend to have. And secondly, this lends to why I personally have always had an interest with Titanic. I've had its ebbs and flows over, periods in my life and how stressed out I was. But it's always been that very human element. It's a human story to me at the end of everything because there were people on that ship who were heading for the best of their lives, and there were some who were probably heading for things they didn't want to be greeting necessarily. Was every spectrum of emotion available and every kind of class of human on this ship to tell a different side of the story.
You bring up such a good point. We always just naturally assume we can imagine what the people were like and what they were
Right.
thinking. But, I think James Cameron did an amazing job depicting that there were
Yeah.
people on board who were in situations like Rose, where she was kind of getting into an arranged marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine the dread in her heart over that. And then she was the one who survived
Yeah.
and Jack didn't. And yeah, you've got to put yourself there and think about those types of feelings, like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. I know that, some people have their criticisms of the film, of Cameron's film, and any film really. But one thing you do have to admire is that being able to tell a past narrative in a present friendly way keeps that connection alive, because I know when I was, younger, I'm going to say, 10 and under, history, quote unquote, as a concept was just an amorphous blob of things that happened at some point very, very far in the past. And there wasn't really, I was 9 or 10 years old. Why would I care about exactly when in the past Egypt was versus, I don't know, Gone with the Wind? It Time didn't really make sense, especially when you've only been alive for 10 years. That's all you have. Being able to see a historical event that wasn't in grainy, choppy black and white, that wasn't 2 seconds at a time, simply because that was the technology at the time, to see it lovingly and sort of through blood, sweat, and tearsy reconstructed in a way that felt like you could reach out and touch it, made the story real in a way that I think really drove up Titanic mania in the latter half of the 90s. Obviously, that's when the movie came out.
Yeah, I think what made it so special is James Cameron really did his homework. He really nailed the research, and there are so many great examples of that, of just little details, and that's really what the secret is, the details.
Yeah. What are some of the, speaking of details and people who did homework, you also did a lot of homework. But when you watch a movie like Cameron's Titanic, what are some of the culinary details that you noticed in particular that you think, I'm glad he included that, because, I didn't think that they would know that?
Well, I was really glad that he included the lamb and mint, because those are examples of the spring ingredients that were prevalent aboard the Titanic. There were so many spring onions. There were all kinds of different things, English peas, things that were just becoming available in the springtime. And back then, that was such a bigger deal than now, because if those things weren't available at certain times of the year, you didn't get them. We didn't have, greenhouses and
there's no strawberries in November.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So I really love that he captured that. And I loved the depiction of third class. I think he really did a great job of highlighting that Titanic was really special in that it was probably the first, either the first or the first with Olympic, or one of the first ships of the time to have a third class that was really much more suitable for traveling for people than it had been. Before the Titanic, in third class, people would eat right where they slept. In most situations, they'd have to bring their own silverware with them and wash it up in the same bucket. If you can imagine hundreds of people, washing up their silverware, and you hope that you're not at the end of that line, because the water barely got changed. And many times they'd have to bring food for their whole family for 10 days, 2 weeks.
That was a shocking fact for me to learn, was that it's not that I was okay with the other facts, but then it was finding out that you had to bring your own food. That must have been very hard, but also probably pretty expensive.
Yeah. And just the kind of unexciting foods that people must have packed and eaten for days, but they did it. They kind of sucked it up to get through the experience, because so many of those people were emigrating to the United States as immigrants. And that's another thing that James Cameron really did his background check on. There were so many different countries that were represented, particularly in third class. And there were Italians, like the Italian who was traveling with Jack. He really brought that into the forefront, I think, for a lot of people for the first time to realize that. So those are a couple of things that I've noticed.
I was flipping through your book, and it happened to open on the gin and tonic recipe, and I shared it with a friend who is a gin aficionado, and she said, it sounds really good, but what was with the proportion of alcohol? Because if I remember correctly, it was less than 1 ounce of gin to about 7 ounces of tonic. And, from our 2022 sensibility, she's like, what the heck is that?
Right. And it's not the original recipe. Those recipes were contributed from various sources. And that was part of the fun of this project too, was to reach out to places where I knew there were experts in pre-prohibition drinks. And also places like, in Southampton, for example, there are places that have active bars now, and some of those recipes are from there. The gin and tonic recipe, I need to look at it right now it's been a little while since I looked at that recipe to know to recall what you're thinking about. And
I play roller derby, and my teammate's name is Gin Demonic after gin and tonics. So I of course had to send this to her immediately, and she loved it. She thinks that the twisted nose gin bottle is beautiful and it sounds delicious, but she would like to know why there is such a light hand on the gin.
Well, that's a good question, and you know what, I'm going to find out. I'm going to reach back to the person that contributed it and get an answer if I can.
I didn't think too much about that, but was it just, I don't know if maybe drinking culture is just so different now than it was then, or maybe drinks were, well, that was about to be the same question in a different wording.
Yeah, and I do you see what page it is? Or there, I found it. Okay. Oh, right. This is from the White Star Tavern in Southampton.
Right. Yes.
I was remembering it. I just wasn't remembering it for sure. And
I clearly obviously didn't either. So
and it's juniper berries and lavender sprig. Oh, that's right. I love this recipe so much.
So I can't drink. I have very sensitive stomach, but I used to be able to. And this sounds like it would smell amazing.
Yeah, it does. And I love to make it. I've actually got some lavender sprigs that I'm growing, and I should make one of these soon. But yeah, it's got a really nice aroma, aromatic element to it. And I love that recipe. It's one of my favorite. I love gin and tonics. I love them because my mother and I love to, that was kind of our with the old fashioned. We always loved old fashions too. But you know what? Cute. That's like interesting. I'll have to take that back and find out if I can get any information about how that recipe was developed. But I'm happy with it. I hope that she was happy with it too.
I think that the next goal is to try to get her a bottle of the actual gin so that she can actually try it at home, because I think I would be just curious, because I know that, today's drinking culture is often about how quickly can I get drunk. So it will be very heavy on the alcohol usually, and that's kind of standard anywhere, I would think. But was drinking culture of the time much more like relaxed? Was it something you kind of did all day and you'd like nurse a cocktail, or did you go through them quicker because you were hot so they couldn't be as alcoholic? Or am I making up a bunch of really odd questions?
No, you're bringing up a really good point. And, all I can think is that it was before Prohibition. So I would tend to my tendency to think of it has always been that there wasn't this, as much as there is today, sort of a taboo or a conservative outlook on it. It was in those years, in 1912, 1911, 1910, there were just starting to be undercurrents of, conservative push against alcohol. In fact, one of the graphics in my book, is of it's the Weatherbird from the St. Louis Dispatch, and he says, "Why not let hotels sell Bronx cocktails on Sundays?" And I thought it was so cute, and it really is indicative of the time that they were. It was more conservative than now.
Absolutely,
but it wasn't sort of this. It's how do I explain what I'm getting at? Now that we've gone through Prohibition and vestiges of that still remain, it's almost sort of like a, we know it's been forbidden in the past. There's a tendency to be a little bit more obsessive with it, or more
Sure.
compulsive with it because it was taboo in the past. But when they were traveling aboard the Titanic, there had never been prohibition. So there was
Right.
never this, it was never hard to come by. And it was never something that you couldn't get your hands on, except on Sundays, things like that.
Sure. Well, of course, why would you need a heavy pour? You'd never be out. I suppose that does make sense. If you've never had a scarcity, why act as though there was one?
Right. And I know that what I would expect is that there were just as many in proportion people that abused alcohol or needed alcohol. And there were also people that, completely abstained. The same types of proportionate differences probably existed. One of the reasons that I would think that is, I came across some information that indicated that crew members in that time frame very often would make their own liquor on board in their crew quarters. And, especially the kitchen staff would have access to wheat and to grains and also to fruits. So it was schnapps that Charles Jockin was drinking, not whiskey like people have always thought.
I heard peppermint schnapps of all things. My gosh.
I didn't know about the peppermint.
That could be a rumor.
Yeah.
I hope it is, because that sounds acrid.
Well, it doesn't sound, I was always thinking peach.
That also doesn't sound great, to be fair.
Peach, or what would have been good? I don't know, a berry schnapps or something.
I almost said cherry, but that sounds worse, actually.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like cough medicine, maybe.
Yep.
Yeah, like I'm thinking Vicks or Robitussin.
How gross.
I know. Let's talk about more fun drinks here. Let's see. But yeah, there were distilleries on board these ships, and I think that the party atmosphere that James Cameron depicted in his movie was probably very accurate. There were probably a lot of, party nights, and the beer on board was by Wrexham Lager, an English brewery, and we don't know for sure, but it's pretty safe to assume that there was probably mostly beer in third class, and in second and first class there would have been more of the more expensive, more sophisticated drinks.
That was actually something I'd written down on a piece of paper that I've lost, but I remember the question, which was, especially with things like drinks and cocktails, which was the primary focus of your book, really. Were there any drinks that would have been just absolutely off limits to certain classes simply because they were considered exclusive, or they had ingredients that even if a person could afford it, this is not for you. You are not welcome in this drink club?
Oh, I would think for sure. I mean, that's where we get that term beer budget. I'm sure just because based on the affordability of alcohol and the exposure too. If you're not traveling in first class, you aren't exposed to a Robert Burns cocktail, and it's so much of what we learn about culture is from our friends and the people we spend time with, and so it's easy to get into a bubble where you're only exposed to beer. That reminds me, like in college, it was so unusual to have a nice cocktail. It was more just beer out of a keg. Yeah, those good old keg parties, and I don't think they would have been as exposed as like John Jacob Astor IV. And I hesitate to use him as an example because I don't know if he was. I don't think he was a big drinker. I do know though that John Jacob Astor IV used to love to savor bottles of champagne at his parties. And they had champagne at his wedding right before the Titanic sailed, a few months before he married Madeline. And
she was like 17, wasn't she? And he was, I don't know how old he was at the time,
I'd have to double check the exact year, but either 17 or 19. She was very
Young,
young and he was in his late 30s. And
30s or something.
to this day, all of the St. Regis hotels around the world at 5 o'clock p.m., whatever time that is, where they are, they saber a bottle of champagne in the lobby. And then everyone gets a drink.
Is the champagne drinkable after you've done that, or do you not use that one because there might be little bits of glass inside?
Gosh, that's a good question. I've never thought of that. And I've had a couple of those champagnes. And
Well, I suppose they must be drinkable.
well, I think it's the clean cut. And I've never done it,
Yeah.
but I can't imagine that there'd be a jagged cut, because
That's a very fair point.
you'd see glass, and every time I've seen it, it's kind of like hot enough against the top of where the cork is.
Oh, wow.
You know how the glass at the top where the cork is a little ridged. That's where they go to whack it off, and it's a clean cut.
That's impressive. I've never seen one done. I've only seen it in the movies, and I guess in the movies it doesn't really need to be a clean cut if it's a prop or what have you. So that makes a lot of sense. But because I've only seen it in films, my first thought was just, it's going to be glass all over the place. I'm also assuming that I'm the swordsman and I would be terrible at it. So
well, you never know.
that's fair.
It'd be fun to try. There used to be I don't know if they still do it, but Pops for Champagne here in the Chicago area, right in Chicago, they would saber there, and that was the first time I was exposed to it. So I did know what it was when I read about it, and I definitely wanted to include it in my book. John Jacob Astor IV also would get dressed up in French cavalier attire, and he was a really fun guy. He loved to do things like that, and he was responsible for so many things that we still have today. Like he was the person he introduced the red velvet ropes that help to control crowds at big events.
The cordons, so he was right.
Yeah. And he was one of the first, if not the first, I hesitate to say the first because I haven't confirmed that, but one of the first people, developers, to put a hotel or any type of business connected to a subway station.
I suppose someone did have to be the first.
Yeah. The Knickerbocker in New York City, there's still a door in the subway station that would have been the door that people would have gone through to get inside the hotel. And now developers and entrepreneurs think of that all the time, of make sure you're by a train station if you're going to open up a business. Well, he actually connected right to the subway.
Wow. Knickerbocker, is that where the Sunday comes from? The Knickerbocker glory?
I don't know.
Again, because I don't drink. Of course, my interests are on sweets.
Well, let's see. Sweets. There's so many great sweets in my book. I'm
tempted to make them all.
Well, and one of the things I love to talk about is the baked apples, because the baked apples were on several menus that I'm aware of, and they're so easy to make and so good for you when apples are good for you. I don't know how good they are for you when you add in the brown sugar and the raisins and the nuts, but
so SpongeBob said it's good for your soul.
It's definitely good for your soul. SpongeBob ought to know. And it's a fall food. So I always tell people, you don't have to have a Titanic food only in the spring. You can have a fall gathering with your friends and watch the movie and have baked apples or apple meringue. Apple Charlotte was on board.
What's that?
It's kind of like an apple, almost like an apple meringue. It's a little bit different, and it's the recipe isn't. I don't have a recipe for it in the book. There weren't recipes for these foods, so I went to people to give me their adaptations, and I was really pleased with how it came together.
I'm sure. I just randomly thought of this. A tea and coffee service back then was a much larger deal than it is now. You couldn't just blitz into a Starbucks, grab a latte, and be on your way in 5 minutes. And that wasn't really the mood of the day. People weren't rushing to meetings. What was
Right.
coffee and tea? What was that really like of, well, between the class, I guess start with first class because that's what everyone's super curious about. But like what in an average day would your coffee and tea routine look like?
Well, I think the most interesting area to look at is steerage, third class,
Ooh, let's start there.
because what was really different in third class is that their big meal of the day was at noontime. So 12:30, somewhere around there. This is how my grandparents always ate. They were very working class and European descent. And they'd always have a great big meal at lunch with bread, butter, beef, gravy, potatoes, even
Very,
on a
very
Wednesday.
filling and heavy.
Very filling and heavy. And then they would eat like, biscuits and cheese in third class. I'm talking about now, where they'd eat for supper, and they called it supper. Dinner was at lunch, and supper was in the early evening, late afternoon.
Okay.
And they'd have biscuits. Gruel was on the menu, watered down oatmeal, kind of like an oatmeal, really watered down.
Right.
Biscuits, cheese, things like that, little snacky foods. And then to hold them over to that meal, they'd have the tea, and they'd have, you'd have the tea, biscuits, and things like that late in the afternoon. And then in the morning, they'd have a big breakfast.
Right.
But the afternoon meals and the early evening meals were just very different, and that's why the tea was so important, because it would hold them over.
That definitely makes sense if you know that that's going to be your big substantiator instead of, as we do now, kind of like almost 3 equal size meals spread out over the course of your day. No, some people vary, but yeah, if you have that knowledge that you have to go that time, especially during the day when you are active, when you're up and moving, you would definitely allocate some sort of snack in there, and tea makes sense.
And in first class, they would have dinner very late, or I should say later than in third class. And the tea would hold them over by having the tea. And tea is so fun. I saw in one of your posts that you love the Titanic tea. That
I do.
Isn't that great tea?
It is. I'm a tea person. I have my tea for one set that I got at the Titanic Museum that I use pretty religiously. I love tea. That's kind of my go-to. Coffee is, I don't and never have like loved coffee. I know everyone else does, and I love that for you. But I'm definitely a tea aficionado, and I had a feeling that especially black tea of that time would have been sort of the go-to for everyone at the time. That could be a guess on my part.
And that's a good guess. What is your favorite tea?
So I really like Earl Grey tea. That's like my go-to.
I would bet there was Earl Grey on board.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah,
that seems like a given.
Yeah. Earl Grey, black, probably currant. And one of my favorite teas is actually from London. It's Strawberry Fool, and it's by I can't think of the maker, but it's so good.
That sounds really good. Is that a black tea?
It's not. It's a very strawberry tea. Ooh. And it's got a little bit of creaminess in it. And I love milk tea from it's from Asia, and I'm trying to think of it, from Hong Kong. I can't remember, but it's so good. Powdery tea. Yeah.
I like Thai iced tea is really good. That's a good one.
Isn't it good?
So good. So it's not good for you, but it's absolutely delicious. At least in my opinion.
Mine too.
Yeah. Going back to the baked apple, just because that for some reason randomly popped into my mind again. But if someone wanted to make one, and if they were foolish enough to have not purchased your book, what would be the easiest way to do that? What do you need to make a classic baked apple 1912 style? Because I'm sure today there's 1,400 variants.
Well, you need 4 ingredients.
Okay.
apples, and I would go with 4 so they can support each other in the pan.
Mm-hmm.
And you need,
Specific kind of apple?
I like Red Delicious. You can use Granny
Mm-hmm.
Smith. Honey Crisp is good anyway, right? Honey Crisp
Right.
are like my favorite. And then brown sugar,
Mm-hmm.
raisins, and nuts. And the nuts are optional, but you really do need the brown sugar. And I lied, I
Mm-hmm.
missed an ingredient: butter. And,
Ah.
good butter, not margarine, but good butter.
Mm-hmm.
So 5 ingredients. I'm gonna take that back. 5 ingredients. So you just want to core out your apple.
Mm-hmm.
Real easy. You get an apple core, and if you don't have an apple core, don't worry about it. You can order one easily enough from Amazon, but you can also, if you're really careful and you use a dull knife that you're not going to get hurt with,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a small one, like a paring knife, you can just cut into the apple for around in a square and pull that core out.
Right, right. Just be careful.
And yeah, be very careful. And you don't need to have the bottom, at the very bottom, you don't need to have that closed, but it helps if you do. But it's hard to get out the core without taking it all out.
That's
So don't
fair.
worry about it.
It's yeah, okay.
So you put the 4 apples together in the pan, and I use a
Mhm,
little square pan so that they get, get supported a little bit.
mhm.
And you pack them really good with brown sugar, raisins, and the nuts if you want to use like crushed walnuts or chopped walnuts. And then you put a butter pat on each
Mhm.
top of each one. And you can put a splash of bourbon or brandy on top if you want.
Ooh,
You don't need to, but it's kind of fun to do that.
sounds
You
like
can
you do need to.
yeah, yeah. You can soak the apples first in
Oh
in
wow.
a in schnapps or brandy or something like that, and then you would just do all this after you soak them, and they'd
Mhm.
be a little softer that way too for the coring.
Right.
And then you put them in the oven, and um, I forget what the directions are, but it's like 375
Mhm.
for about 45 minutes to an hour.
Right.
Just let them bake away, and then there's one requirement. There's 6 ingredients. You got to have whipped cream or ice cream with them.
I was gonna
Put
say,
that,
what do you serve it with? Because there must be something just to temper that richness at this point.
yeah, and raisin rum ice cream
Ooh.
or a chantilly cream is always really good. It's actually better, I think, with ice cream. It's a little thicker than the
Mhm.
chantilly cream. The chantilly cream will run down quicker when it's
Right.
over something warm like that. But it's you got to have some kind of cream.
That sounds so good. But speaking of ice cream, your book touches on this too. Is that was pretty new on board ships, and Titanic was the first or one of the first to have the facilities for ice cream.
Yep. And there was an ice man, or at least one person we know who was on staff dedicated to preparing the ice, making sure there was enough ice. And Adolf Mattmann was from Switzerland, a
Hmm.
young boy, first job. He was so excited. He said that he
How old was
wanted,
he?
I think he was 19, pretty sure he was
Oh,
19. Yeah, and he said, if I can get this job on the Titanic, I'll be able to get a job at any restaurant in London.
oh,
So
cute.
yeah, I know, and it's such a great story about how important it was to these people to get these jobs
Yeah.
and how much it meant to them. And unfortunately, Adolf did not survive. And I've gotten a lot of information from the people that live in the community he lived
Mhm.
in Switzerland. They really embrace the legacy, their Titanic connection, which is Adolf Mattmann.
That's amazing. What's his story? What do they have to say about him? What do they want everyone to know about him?
Just pretty much the way I described it, that's it in a
Okay.
nutshell.
Well,
He was a really ambitious kid, wanted to
yeah.
get out and explore, and that story is very indicative of
Yeah.
many of the crew members.
Yeah, and I feel as though that's an important story too, is that for many of these people, it was a job. Not to say that he wasn't necessarily excited to be on Titanic, but it was probably more of the notion of I get to have this specific kind of position. I'm at the forefront of culinary technology. And on top of it, as an added bonus, I'm on this bloody ship. But, I'm sure that for him, maybe that was secondary, but it was what it represented.
What it represented. Exactly.
Because that was really like what made the Titanic so like what did they do? What was special that they were able to have ice cream that no one else did? Was it just that they had freezers? What went into making sure that they could have fresh ice cream in the middle
Well,
of the Atlantic?
you're bringing up a good point, because yes, the electricity had a lot to do with it. However,
Mhm.
there's also the fact to consider that they went to great extent to have a French concessionaire. Actually, he was Italian, Luigi Gatti, but
Gelato is fantastic, so
isn't it? I love it's so smooth. I love
the
gelato.
best.
I don't remember when I first tried it, but it's just I love it. I love Talenti gelatos.
Yes, they're so good.
Closest to Italy I think you can get.
Hmm.
But the French restaurant staff and all the different French foods, there was such an incredible influence. And so the ice cream was probably part of that as well, of
Mhm.
making this a really great culinary experience for passengers.
Yeah, because that must be something that was really exclusive at the time because, that sort of technology was really new. And then maybe not I can see where some other lines might be like, yeah, I'm not going to invest the money in that until I know it works. Because it could
Yeah.
have been, maybe they could have gotten in the middle of the ocean and been like, oh, actually, this doesn't work when we're not close to land. Well, get all right.
I'll tell you, Alexia, when I look at that ship behind me, I can see it there now.
Mhm.
Isn't it hard to believe that that many people were on there and all this stuff was happening on it?
It's, as people keep pointing out, it's its own universe, it's its own society, it's its own microcosm. And it is for 7 days, because for those 7 days, even though you are exactly who you are, you don't have home base, you don't have that network of friends or comfortable places. You can't have an argument and go to your comfortable spot down the street. You're in the middle of nowhere and there's a bunch of strangers around you. It must have been a very, very exciting and also for some people, probably a very scary experience.
I'm sure, especially like I would think for a third class more than
Yeah.
anywhere. One of the ways that I learned about what was on the menus is by reading letters that were sent home from people that boarded in Southampton. And then when the Titanic docked in Cherbourg, they
Mhm.
were able to mail their letters. And
Because not many actual menus themselves really survived, right?
right. And particularly in third class, of course, which is,
Right.
um, an example of, where we see that there weren't that many people that were able to survive. But these letters people talked about in these letters the foods that they ate.
Hmm.
And one of my favorites was written by Adolphus Saalfeld, who did survive. And he was carrying perfume samples with him that were found only
Huh.
recently at the resting site. And he wrote
Wow.
home about the apple dessert that he had, and the beer that he drank, the
Mhm.
pork chop that he ate. He wrote home to his wife. And so those letters are really telling of the foods. Some of the menus were actually postcards that people would mail home.
Oh,
And the postcard would be, the front would be the menu, and then on the other side, they would write their message and the address. And
that's
so
actually really neat. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they made those at the time.
I keep waiting for some airline or cruise ship now to do that. I think that would be really fun.
Especially cruise ships. I've been on a cruise before and I remember being impressed with the food and I definitely hadn't paid for I was in college. I definitely hadn't paid for any upgrades or anything, but I just remember being astounded at the food and how much there was. And, this is in the 2010s sometime when, cruise lines have become their own massive industry.
Yeah. Maybe they do that and I don't even know it, but
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Well, there were many different things like that we have, and one of the things that happened was that people would tuck a menu away in their pocket. And they had it from lunch or dinner that day, and then that was their coat that they grabbed to get in a lifeboat. And one of my favorite menus was the one that Elise Lurette saved. And the reason I love it is because it's so telling of her and her preferences. She crossed out one of the menu items from lunch, which was Welsh rarebit. And I thought, what is
very
that?
heavy? I don't exactly know what it is, but I think I looked it up at one point in time and remember thinking that is a lot.
Yeah, very heavy. Like it just kind of sinks into your tummy.
It's like a meat and cheese thing, isn't it? Meat, cheese, and some breading, or am I making up a different dish?
Well, close. You're right on close. It's not with the meat so much, although you could add some prosciutto or something if you wanted to. But it more traditionally is a sliver of apple or pear or something like that in between. But it's bread. It's an open-faced cheese sandwich, pretty much. It's bread toasted, and then over that there's a cheese mixture made with beer and several different cheeses, melted down and poured over the bread and broiled, paprika on top. I love to put paprika on it. And then, like I said, the sliver of apple is optional. You can make it taste really tasty, but
sounds amazing.
Yeah, they're really good and very filling and fun for a winter's night. And the anniversary of the 25th anniversary of the movie's coming up in December. So I'm thinking of all these wintry foods to make for a movie party night or something.
Right. That would be a really good one. And especially because I live mostly in Maryland, and around that time we'd be able to go pick fresh apples to really be able to get that right.
Yeah. And, it's interesting too, speaking of the different seasons, there was also roast turkey and stuffing served in second class and cranberry sauce.
Very fall to me.
Very fall. Yeah. And so you can kind of do a Thanksgiving type of dinner and have it be a Titanic dinner. You don't have to make an 11-course meal. You can do these fun things. One of the things I like to do is I like to have when I have friends over for cocktails or something, or just to visit, I'll have the cheeses that were always served for lunch. There's same assortment of cheeses every day. And just by doing little things like that, you can, have a little touch of the Titanic in your gathering.
What were the cheeses then that were served every day?
Well, let me get the list out there. One of them was Camembert and Cheshire Saint Evil, which is a soft, like a cream cheese. And I hope I can find this.
I have so many friends, including myself, that are very, very, very large fans of cheese. And I'm already now planning out things that I am going to do for the 25th watch party that I will be hosting, either alone or with friends.
Oh, good. Oh, that's exciting. That is really exciting.
Yeah,
I love to hear that.
It seems like a fun thing to do, but cheese is also especially, I think that's a good staple to have almost any season, because it can be light, or you can do something really heavy. Like my dad loves a baked brie. If you want to get really robust, you can go that route. Otherwise, you can do light things to pair with, white wine or something.
Exactly. Roquefort was one of them. There were about 8 different ones, and it didn't pop out at the full list, didn't pop out at me, and I won't need to go into all of them anyway. But it's a concrete list. It's a very dedicated assortment, and I love it that it sort of tells us about what what the trends were in the time in the cheeses.
Is there anything, cheese or not cheese, is there anything that was like a major staple of the food of that time that we don't have it now, either because it's illegal or unhealthy or extinct or whatever the case may be, that would absolutely shock people from 1912? They would just be like, what do you mean you don't have blank anymore? How do you live?
I would pick tripe. I would I would pick that as a example of something. Tripe was very common in third class. It was on the menu, and it still is in many cultures and societies, but
Right.
for our culture, many people have never even heard of it.
Or they just know it's quote unquote icky.
Yeah. Or it's not it's not as socially accepted as it would have been then.
Well, that is fair.
As it was then. Yeah, no one thought anything of it. And now I don't think people would be as accepting of it. And another one is one that I mentioned already, which is the gruel. I think 99% of people nowadays would say, what? You're not going to give me gruel? That just sounds like gruel. But
interesting.
it was a menu item then. It was like, it had a totally different connotation. So
yeah,
I love that question.
Now it's, you say you're going to give somebody gruel, it's a punishment.
Right. And back then it was like, oh, we're having gruel tonight for dinner. And when you think about it, it sounds kind of pretty. If you didn't know all the negative connotations, you might actually like it.
That's prison food or whatever the designation is. That's really interesting, because I think one of the points that can be made is that things aren't all that different. People have always liked coffee and tea and alcohol and good food, but that there are, just as in fashion, as in writing, as in anything, there are trends, and they are visible and notable, especially when you plot them back.
Definitely. Yeah. Cows have 3 stomachs. Yes. And one of them is what people go to make the tripe, and it's a whole process of resting the tripe in a milk, letting it tenderize in the milk. And I actually got to know one of my dearest friends now through Facebook and Instagram by reaching out to her through Facebook for her grandmother's tripe recipe for the book. And
really?
Yeah, she's in South Africa, and it's winter there now. She's posting about the winter sunsets, and you would love her. She posts on Instagram, and she's a wonderful food blogger, and her name is Sonia, and she's just been so fun. I'm in touch with her every day.
Oh, that's awesome.
This research really was extensive, but it really connected me with some amazing people.
And I think that, to me, sounds like the most rewarding part, is being able to connect on something you love and connect with people everywhere. Because I'm not going to lie to you. If you had asked me, where do you think my tripe recipe came from? I don't think I would say from a friend you met online in South Africa. I'm probably sure I'd say, I don't know, some old cookbook from somewhere.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
These unexpected little connections, and I believe that those are also what help keep the legacy of Titanic really alive and relevant year after year after year.
It's the people that keep that alive, and I'm so grateful that I've gotten to know so many people like you and others who keep the memory of these people alive. It's just terrific.
I remember the first time because you were on LA Beatles' podcast, Unsinkable the Titanic pod, and I remember, I'm not one of those people that often reaches out just if I'm a fan. I like to have a quote unquote a reason. I don't know, otherwise I feel like I'm bothering people. But I sent her an email just telling her my Titanic story, and I figured nothing would happen of it, because also I'm like, she's probably gonna be like, oh, okay, but she wrote me back.
Isn't she terrific?
She's amazing. I actually get to interview her in a couple of weeks, and I'm probably going to scream. I'm gonna have to dance in the car beforehand. So
Oh, I'm so excited to hear that for
I'm
you. That's
really
going to be
excited.
great.
Yeah, because she also completely takes a different approach where she has a topic and a script and researches like a real professional. But I, it was that notion that you can reach out and just connect with somebody, or like with you, is that I could buy your book and then I'm talking to you. It's like, what? Oh, this is an amazing ability to be able to make these connections and find common ground across different things. Like, I'm not a food writer. I was an English major and then I got my business degree. I don't have a culinary history. I have a Titanic interest, and yet I picked up your book because I heard about it and it sounded really fun.
I like to think it is a fun book and a
It's a fun
positive
book.
angle on, these really tragic stories, but
Yeah.
it just goes to show you that there's a light in everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all want to find that light for the Titanic stories because
Yeah.
they're so important and we want to keep them alive.
They are. And things like, excuse me, things like food and drink, especially. And I think now that, people are beginning to socialize a little bit more, even if they're, doing so still cautiously because, the pandemic is still going, food and
Mhm.
drink are one of the things that's what you do with your friends when you want to meet. Can you come to happy hour? Can you come to dinner? Can you come to brunch? Can you come for drinks? It's how we connect with people, and it's how, it's just the simple ways of bonding with people. And when people decide to have their Titanic party, I know that maybe there's some people in the fandom that think that's frivolous or silly, but to them it's their way of saying, I am honoring this memory in this way.
Exactly. Keeping those memories fresh and sharing those stories. And it's really great that there are people like you in LA who are doing that
I
very
I
well.
I haven't done it yet, but I mean, I really appreciate the thoroughness that she puts into her podcast. And I also appreciate the breadth, because deviating from food, drink, and books a little bit, I talked to somebody else recently, and they brought up the point that people who came to the Titanic community in via the Cameron film often get sort of kicked down or looked down on in a way. And I'll say that I'm 33. I was 8 or 9, I can't do math, at the time that the movie came out. So my question, it's like, I don't know how else I would have been expected to find Titanic in that day and age. It would have been very hard to avoid the Cameron film and find it via a book. It was simply everywhere. And I
Yeah.
think that that's really unfortunate, to try to instantly bar people out of a community simply for how they found it, because the Cameron film's not a documentary. You can't learn everything from it, but what it can teach you is that this was a thing that happened and it affected so many lives.
Yeah, exactly. And it really is well researched, really well. And right spot on with, almost 100% of the things. And so I think it was so great the way the clothing, the fashion was
Mm.
depicted. And just one of my favorite scenes from any movie ever was seeing Rose get out of the vehicle and go to board the Titanic in that fabulous
Oh,
outfit.
I saw recently in the Titanic subreddit, someone posted, what is your favorite Rose outfit? And just, I think that pinstripe car outfit just swept it like the Oscars.
Oh, just exactly. And can you imagine how much fun she had wearing those clothes, all those
Oh my
different
gosh.
outfits?
They're so beautiful. And I think with Rose, because she's the main character, obviously everyone focuses on her outfits. But for people like her mother, I know that, I think I read in Cameron's thing that they played a little bit with Rose's wardrobe. Like, I think most women of the day would have had a hat and she wears it one time. How accurate were the other outfits? Were they
Oh,
really note perfect?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. When you think of the newspaper boy hats in third class and
Yeah.
the top hats and the bowlers and
Mm-hmm.
for the women, those wonderful um, the hats that they wore were
Mm-hmm.
incredible. Yeah, it was really spot on.
I feel like by today's standards, those hats would be quote unquote ridiculous, but that just was of the time. It was about how big is my hat and how much more grand is it than yours?
Yes. And then there were the hats too, like the Mary Poppins look. I always tell
Mm-hmm.
people if you're looking for a Edwardian outfit, think of
Right.
Mary Poppins and that broad rimmed hat with the real short top
Little
of it
brim.
was short, the little brim.
Yeah,
That's a really good example right there.
that's a beautiful hat. With
Yeah.
the with all the clothes and what have you, what was the prime like for young women? Obviously, again, Rose being the biggest, most modern example that there is, but what was the ideal silhouette at that time? I know that it was kind of transitioning out of the Victorian style, much more like big hip bustle skirt and into this more, this is the empire waist is what it's called. I think
Yeah.
that's what it is.
Empire,
Empire?
Empire
Yeah.
waist. Very much so. You just nailed it. Empire was big and very
Mhm.
more sleek compared to the Victorian lines. They were more straight.
Mhm.
Um, there were still uh, dresses and skirts with a little bit of a train in some
Right.
instances, but for the most part, that sort of voluminous look of the Victorian years had really morphed into a more um, sleek, more A-line um, appearance.
They were every dress she wears except the sinking dress, I will say, looks like it gives you a very small footprint though. Is that by design?
I don't know if it is. That's a good question.
Looks like she takes really small steps, and I'm thinking
Oh,
to like
yeah.
my favorite skirt is, I like a big twirly princess Disney nonsense skirt, but there's no limits. I could do the splits in that if I were flexible enough to do that, but in the scene I remember her running to the back of the ship. I remember even thinking that her footsteps seemed like, not like she wasn't running all out. And I think it's just because the circumference of her skirt it was an A-line skirt. They're not meant to be voluminous, and you're not meant to be pelting down to the stern of a ship in those.
You bring up a really interesting point. And in fact, just a few years before the Titanic, a new trend was set. It was not everyone embraced this trend, but
It's a
Lucille Carter
controversial one.
did. Yeah, it's the hobble skirt. And women actually fell
Ah,
down because they were literally tied up at the ankles. And
yeah.
Lucille Carter wore the hobble skirt, which was known for her fashion sense. And she and her husband were the owners of the Renault car that was the one that, the steamy windows scene in the movie.
Oh,
And she was known for her, really trendy style and fashion. And that hobble skirt being popular would make sense with what you're making note of, that um, they probably did have more narrow steps.
mhm.
The step that they could take was more narrow because of the narrow skirts.
I feel like she wouldn't be able to get into or out of her own car with the hobble skirt. There's
Right.
more than one step there.
Yeah. And there were stories of women getting into accidents because
I'm
of
sure.
wearing their hobble skirts.
That sounds, because I've seen them before. I mean, like, I've not seen them in person because thankfully I've never seen a human being wear one. I'd question their sanity. But you've seen in museums and what have you, and you just look at that and think, the second you encounter a cobblestone that you didn't see, your day is ruined.
Yes. Yeah.
Gosh.
It's hard to believe, but it's hard to believe too. When I was in my 20s, I was required to wear, pantyhose skirts, heels. It was unheard of to wear pants, you
Sure.
know, absolutely unheard of to wear pants to work. So, it's amazing how these things change.
Right.
And then you think way back, you can't hardly believe some of the things people wore.
It is wild. And I think you touched on this a little bit with LA and her interview, and that especially women's clothing were basically designed, sans corset even, that you just could not get yourself into or out of them. in comparison to, say, a modern day, even like a full coverage dress, a typical long sleeve, maybe skater style skirt, how restrictive in comparison would a long sleeve, long skirt dress of that day be?
Well, they loosened up throughout the years, and
Mm-hmm.
not as tight and restrictive as the Victorian dresses and
Mm-hmm.
in the years prior, but still somewhat restrictive. And then after that era, things got even a little bit looser, and now we don't really wear anything like that anymore, and it's certainly
Right.
not on a daily basis.
Of course, it's basically, I mean, I know that again, as fashion was changing, I'm sure that as the Empire waistline became much more popular, corsets may have become less popular because they give you that hourglass figure. And if you're looking for the column style figure, that may be counterintuitive to what you're doing. But in 1912, for women in first and second class, it was basically expected, was it, that you would wear a corset? Or was that mostly a first class thing? And everyone else was kind of free to breathe?
I would think it would depend on the outfit. If you were
Very
wearing
true.
something that, even maybe someone traveling in steerage might have had a corset for certain outfits.
That is a
Um,
very good point.
of some, it's surprising some of the people that were traveling in third class. Some of
Mhm.
them had means,
Right.
and they might very well have had an outfit that would have worked with a corset.
That's a fair point. I'm sure there are some people that just couldn't justify the cost of a first class ticket, who may have had the
Right.
money, but simply just didn't want to spend it on that.
Right. And, you know, um, I would think for the most part, though, there weren't a lot of women wearing corsets, but
That's fair.
I've actually never looked into that. And it's interesting to think about it.
Because I know, again, there's that scene in the Cameron film where Ruth is lacing Rose into her corset. So it's, very obvious that whatever outfit she's about to put on, that is required. But in something like the sinking dress, or even the I'm flying dress, which again has that very obvious of her waistline, it seems like a corset may have worked against the look you were trying to give yourself.
For sure. Definitely.
I know, like, if I were, for whatever reason, attempting to look like a column, I don't think that I would go reaching for a cincher. That's not a silhouette we're looking for. At least I'm not looking for these days, but power
Right.
to you if it is.
I think we love to talk about this topic because it really helps us connect with these people and
Yeah.
understand them better and what their life might have been like. And it just makes us connect more with that time
Mhm.
and understanding the clothing, the foods, the music.
Yeah, the music. I
Yeah,
read, the accepted narrative seems to definitely be it was Nearer My God to Thee, but there's a lot of people who argue that the final song was just a regular choral piece called Autumn, or the Autumn Song.
and that's what I would tend to think based on my research.
I
Edith
agree.
Rosen, you think so too?
I do.
Yeah. Edith Rosenbaum Russell pointed out the very important point that
Mm-hmm.
the band members even said, one of them ran into his friend Violet Jessup in the stairwell
The
jockeying.
nurse.
Yeah. And he said, we're going to go and cheer people up a little bit. We're going to play a few songs to cheer people up.
Mm-hmm.
So it really would contradict that mission to cheer people up by playing
Mm-hmm.
Nearer My God to Thee.
Yeah, it would be like saying, I'm going to play you Happy Birthday and then playing somebody taps.
Yeah, exactly. And Edith pointed out that, they never would have done that because they didn't want people to lose hope. And when we think of like how do people face what we think might seem like certain death at the time, that it would certainly seem like certain death.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anyone ever accepts that
Right.
until they have to. But I mean, I do think that everyone on board was hoping that they would survive.
Oh
That
gosh, I
ship would
hope you
come.
imagine just by
Yeah.
some chance that maybe that lifeboats are going to come back for you, just for
Yes.
you.
Yeah.
Gosh, I can imagine. But like, I I'm a violinist. I'm classically trained, and
Oh,
I will say I know that a lot of people's, the argument was like, well, as they were going to the water and they knew they were going to die, they might have played a hymn. I'm like, at the angle that ship was, the band would have had to have stopped playing kind of long before that moment happened, because there's simply no way you'd be able to have traction to stand and hold your instrument. And so it makes
right.
sense to me that they would have stopped at a time when they were still playing cheery music. And that's why I personally have come to the exceptionally knowledgeable conclusion that the final song might have been Autumn, because there's a point where you are simply, you can't do it. You need your hands to hold yourself in place. You saw that in the film as people eventually started to hold on to things. And a violin requires two hands.
Yeah. And that's amazing that you're a violinist. How neat.
I love the instrument. I think there was always a little pride in hearing the story of Jacques and be like, that's a violinist spirit
That's
for
right.
you. I mean, we're not all nice, but like, it is nice to see yourself in, or to see a little bit of something that, as you say, that you can connect with, where it's like, I also play the violin. And then I think I get to ask myself that question, like, gosh, would I have popped it out of its case and tried to calm folks, or would I have kissed my violin goodbye and made a run for it?
You don't know until you face that.
I think
Yeah.
that's the true, I believe the true intrigue of it is that we can research this all we want. Like I could learn everything I wanted about Jacques and basically build an AI of him if I wanted to. And I'd still never be able to accurately predict what I would do in that kind of situation, simply because I've never encountered it, and I really hope that I never do.
Yeah. I hope so too. I really do. And if you do encounter it, that you have a positive outcome. And
Mhm.
even the people that didn't have a positive outcome, they,
Yeah.
in a way, they kind of did, many of them, because of the legacy they left behind with the way they
Mhm.
helped people. Like Major Archibald Butt was known to
Mhm.
be a gentleman to the end and helping women into lifeboats. One of them said that it was like she felt like she was being tucked in for a motor car ride. And I thought, what a wonderful man he must have been to give her that feeling.
What a gift to give somebody during the most harrowing night of their life, to make them feel as though their step to salvation was just like getting into a motor car.
Yeah,
Must have
yeah,
been, and my personal sort of, I guess, Titanic hero is First Officer William Murdoch, because he operated on the women and children first, and because of that, allowed many men onto the boats when there were none nearby, and that saved a lot of people. And it's those little stories that you hear about people that help you feel connected, because it's people doing their jobs. Like Joaquin was a violinist. Murdoch was an officer. These are people that were simply doing what they were supposed to do, quote unquote, but they were doing so in the face of a circumstance that, if it were ever acceptable to just abandon post, it would have been then.
right. Yeah. Well, it's so good to talk with you about this.
You
You can
too.
tell I love it as much as you do, and I really want to thank you so much for this
Oh
conversation.
gosh, thank you so much for coming on. I am definitely going to have you back in the future, because I have a feeling,
I would love
I
it.
mentioned my friend and I are going to be doing that little party together where I'm making recipes from your book and she's making recipes from a different book. And she bought a different Titanic tea. So we're going to have a little taste sample. And I have a feeling we're going to have questions out of that.
Oh, you guys are so fun. That sounds amazing.
I'm
That
really
sounds really nice.
excited. But thank
Good.
you so much for letting me pick your brain. Thank you so much for coming on. Um, it was amazing to talk to you.
You
Um,
too.
Guys, I cannot overstate how well the interview went and how excited I was to be able to talk to Veronica. And if you want to get in touch with her, her name is Veronica Hinke, and that last name is spelled Hinke. You can get her book, or get in touch with her through her website, which is www.foodstringer.com. That's FOODSTRINGER. TRINGER.com. And you can find her on Twitter. The username is foodstringer, all one word. Instagram is also foodstringer, FOODSTRINGER. And she is on Facebook as facebook.com/vhinke.